Hello friends, and welcome back to my YouTube channel, where today I'm going to be walking you through how and why I make my dice molds. This style of mold is called a vented squish mold. It's a style that was originally developed by Caro's Dice. I'll go ahead and put her tutorial down below in the description. I learned from her. I'm very thankful that she shared this information. All I did was tweak a couple of things and convert it into a slab style mold rather than individual molds. So in the first half of this video, I'm going to be walking through how I make the mold, and then in the second half, I'm going to be walking through the advantages and the disadvantages of this mold style compared to something like a cap mold. So with all of that being said, let's go ahead and jump into how I make my slab vented squish molds. To begin, I'm going to be taping off the one faces of my master dice. These are going to be the cap face, so if you would like a different face to be your cap face, like your high faces instead of your low faces, you would tape those off instead. The reason that I go for low faces is because, as Caro says in her original video, if I'm going to have a face that has some marks and some ugliness to it, it might as well be the worst thing that you can possibly roll on the die. And I agree with that, so this is how I choose to make my molds. And the reason that I am taping off these faces is because in a little bit you will see that we're going to be molding some clay to be covering these die faces, and I don't want that clay to get into the numbers because then you have to pick it out and it's a huge pain. So this will help keep those faces clean and protected. And to note, when you are doing this, you just want to make sure that you're cutting the tape, first of all, that you're not cutting your Dice Masters, but also that you're just cutting the tape a little bit short of the edge. All you want is for the tape to not go over the edge of the die. When my masters are all taped up, I am then going to just apply some Vaseline to what is going to be my mold housing. This is just a piece of glass Tupperware that I had in my house. You can use all sorts of containers. Some people use PVC, you could use plastic Tupperware, you could use like a little cardboard box, but applying mold release is really going to help with getting the slab out of the mold later. This is only something I just started doing, and I should have been doing it for a long time. Do this, it's so helpful. Once you have the Vaseline applied, you're going to want to form little pucks out of clay and then place those pucks into your mold. This is going to form what will be the reservoir. And these are actually pucks that I have already baked so that I can reuse them, which I, once again, only just started doing, and I highly recommend that you bake your pucks. So using Sculpey clay or any sort of polymer clay, you don't want a non-polymer clay. You need polymer clay or your silicone cure will get really funky. It'll inhibit, it'll get weird. Use a polymer clay. All you have to do is roll up a little ball, squidge it down so that it is a flat puck, shape it to your preference, bada bing, bada boom, you've got your puck. And I choose to use Sculpey 3 just because it is the softest, but you can use any sort of polymer clay. And then the shape and size of your puck is just going to depend on your mold housing and your dice size, so play around and figure out what works best for you. Next up, we're going to be placing these little indicator marks. This is going to help with situating the caps correctly in their mold. So just rolling up little tiny balls of clay and then dropping them down onto those pucks, giving them a little push to make sure that they are secure there. Most of these, I only do one indicator mark. On a few of them, I will be doing 2 indicator marks, and that is because I'm going to have 2 D20s, and then my D10 D% shape are the same, and I want to be able to very easily differentiate what cap goes with what die. So adding the extra indicator mark just makes it very clear that one of the D20s has 1 mark, one of them has 2, the D10 has 1 mark, the D% mark has 2, no chance of mixing those things up. And then we move on to what for me is the hardest part in the process. So we are going to be forming little shapes of the face of each die. So out of just a tiny bit of clay, you're going to be making a little die shape. So this is a little tiny square for my D6. And of this shape, you're then going to kind of squidge it onto your die, and then I use my fingers to further position and shape it after trying to do it just with my hands. But important things to note here is that You do not want this clay to go over the edge of your die face. You want it to come just short of all of the edges. That is very important. That's kind of one of the critical aspects of this mold style. And it'll take some trial and error, some practice. With like the tiny D20 faces, it will certainly be a pain when you're just getting started, but it does get easier over time. So you just want to shape your clay so that it is relatively similar to the die shape. It is close to the edges without going over. The closer it is, the more room you will have to work with in your mold. The smaller the shape is, the less room you will have to work with in your mold. But again, you want to balance that with not going over the edge. And you can see here that I am using my nail to just kind of push along that edge, make sure it's really clean, make sure that clay is not going over. And you want to keep in mind that you will then be pushing this onto that puck that we have. So there is going to be some spread from the pressure of you setting this down. So keeping that into account, you then want to go ahead and pop that on a puck. I always try to set mine a little bit off center. I want more puck on one side of the die than another because that is going to give us more space for our reservoir. Hopefully that will make a little bit more sense later, but yeah, placing it a little bit off center, and then sometimes I'll pick it up just to double check that it didn't squidge out too badly, and then you can just go ahead and reposition it. Even remove that indicator mark if you need a little bit more space, and you can put that back on after the die is on the puck. And here, this is what it should look like. If you can get one up, we have that puck, that'll be our reservoir, and then that little die face stand, that is the squish aspect of the vented squish mold. And then I'm just throwing a little bit of Vaseline onto the bottom of this to help it stick down more securely. But these actually don't need to be secured to the bottom of the mold housing. They just need to be weighted down enough that they won't move when you pour your silicone. If some silicone gets under it, that is totally okay. We're going to be cleaning things up later, so not too big of a deal. And then I just wanted to show the process again with another shape so that you can see it really comes down to just forming that shape, which you always want to go smaller than you think, and then making sure that it is covering as much as possible without going over the edge. You need to be sure that you are covering the number completely. So my D10 for this mold, I was actually very close to not completely covering that number. That is a problem because then the mold will not pick up that part of the number. That's kind of a permanent issue if you then cast it that way. So make sure that you're covering the number fully, but not going over the edge. But again, if you do go over the edge, not a big deal. It just means that you need to sand another side of the die, but the mold will still be completely and totally functional. So don't worry too much if you do go over the edge a little bit. So just go ahead and repeat that step with all of the dice, and once you have them all situated in the mold, it'll be time to pour the silicone. Somehow I lost this footage, I don't know how, but follow the instructions on your silicone, pour high and slow. I use Dragon Skin 10 medium, that is my preferred. I have used Dragon Skin 20, I just found it was a little bit difficult to get the dice out of the mold, so I prefer a softer silicone, and I did not like Dragon Skin 10 fast, so 10 medium is my golden boy. I love him, he works perfectly. I cure my molds in a pressure pot at 40 psi, that is 10 psi higher than the maximum I will ever cure my dice at. You want to cure it higher than what you will cure your dice at. And if you do not have a pressure pot or a vacuum chamber, I recommend that you look up tips for how to get rid of bubbles in silicone. A lot of people will put it in a freezer to slow down the cure, but that's something I'm kind of unfamiliar with, so do your research. So now we are going ahead and after pulling our mold out of its housing, we're cleaning up around this puck. This is also part of the reason why baking the pucks is actually really helpful. It makes this cleanup step a bit easier than trying to clean up over soft clay. So with an X-Acto knife, I'm just trimming up all of this excess silicone that seeped under our pucks. Again, I mentioned it's not super important to secure your puck down because we're going to be doing this stage where we're cutting away the excess silicone anyway. Then we are going to be removing all of the clay from the molds. Again, this is easy with the baked pucks. If you don't bake your pucks, they're going to come out kind of in pieces as you pull it out, but that's all right. And then same thing with any silicone that gets between that puck and then that little die stand. is you're just going to take an X-Acto knife and very carefully, remember your masters are under there, you don't want to cut up your masters if you can avoid it, very carefully trim away any silicone that is over top, and then peel all of that clay out. Again, because this clay is not baked, it will come out in little pieces, and there will certainly be some residue left behind. That's okay. Those like little clay crumbs that are like stuck in the corners and such, not a big deal. You don't need to worry about trying to clean that off completely. It's not going to really interfere with the mold as long as you don't have a huge chunk of clay left somewhere in the mold. So don't worry too much about the little remnants. Just try to get the bulk of the clay out as best you can. Again, taking your time to trim away any of that silicone that has come over the top of it, to make sure that you have a nice clean face for your cap to get cast in. And as with most steps in this process, after this point it is just rinse and repeat. Get all of the clay out, completely clean out your molds, but do not take the tape off yet. It is not time for that. We're only taking the clay out right now. Why are we only taking the clay out right now? Because now it is time to apply our mold release, aka Vaseline or petroleum jelly, right, whatever you have on hand, and you want to very liberally apply this everywhere over the top of this mold. So into where we're going to be pouring the silicone for our caps, and then also all along the top of this mold, because there will probably be some silicone spillage, and it's just a lot easier to clean up if you apply mold release everywhere. Being super thorough, super liberal, don't skimp with your mold release here. It is better to have too much than too little. So really make sure that you're going into all of those little indicator dots, all of the sides of these little cap faces, etc. And then, once you have done that, now you can take the tape off. So again, be very careful here because you can scratch your masters with the tweezers if you're not being cautious. So you just want to peel that painter's tape or blue tape or whatever you used off of the die face. You can do that either by going through a corner like I've done on these last two dice, or you can do that by puncturing through where the number is if you're worried about scratching your dice, and then using that puncture to kind of start your tear and tearing the tape up from there. That way you're not trying to scrape the surface of your master, you're just going in through the number. It's a little bit safer, but maybe a little bit more difficult. And here I wanted to show that a little bit of silicone seeped under the tape. So for that, I just pick it up really carefully with my tweezers, and then when it's lifted off of the die face, I use my X-Acto knife to really carefully cut that away. Again, I don't want to scratch the surface of my masters. And this silicone pouring footage I did not lose, so mix up your silicone. I actually use Dragon Skin 20 for my caps. I don't know why, but I just use a Higher Shore silicone for my caps. You don't have to, I just do. There's no reason for it. And then go ahead and fill in all of your little mold caps. Again, you want to be clean, but if you get a little bit on the surface of the mold, it doesn't matter because we applied mold release there anyway. And for the second time, I am curing this at 40 psi in my pressure pot, and then it is time to remove the caps, and we are almost done making molds. I know it's a long process, but here you can see that the silicone actually was stuck a little bit somewhere where I didn't have enough mold release. That is okay. All you need to do there is go ahead and take your X-Acto knife. It's a good little tool. You use it all throughout this process. And then you just want to, you'll see it again here in just a moment. You just want to use that X-Acto knife, put some tension on wherever it is stuck, and do little tiny cuts like this to separate that from the area of which it is stuck so that you can get your caps up and off. So not a complicated process at all. Get all of your caps out of their little homes. And then the next step, we are going to go ahead and cut in our sprues and reservoirs, and then we'll be about done. So here you can see where that puck was, I have a lot more room on the bottom rather than that top area. So that is where I want to cut my reservoir. That's why I position my dice a little bit off center. And you are cutting part of the way into that little die face section that we molded earlier. You don't want that cut to be too deep, but it needs to be deep enough that you believe resin will be able to flow through it. That is going to be our sprue. And then the rest of it that is coming out of what was our puck is going to be our reservoir that then fills up the sprue, which delivers the resin to the die. Same thing with the D12 here. I can't do it on the bottom left because there's not enough space. Same with the top, so that kind of right side here is my best shot for cutting in that area. Once again, going a little bit onto where that little molded die face bit, and there's not a name for it, I wish there was, it'd make this a lot easier. Where that bit is, that's going to be our sprue, and then the rest of it is coming out of that puck, that is going to be our reservoir. So you are cutting into both aspects of this. If it gets stuck, you just cut it out or give it a little tug. It'll come off pretty easily. So you're cutting little pizza slices out of all of your caps. Smaller caps like a D20 can be more difficult because you have a lot less space to work on. So although there's room here on that left side, that is also where the tip of my number is, and I don't want to cut there, right? I don't want to cut into my number, so I'm still going to prefer the left side because I have more space to cut into the die face without hurting my number at all. Whereas if I tried to cut on the left side, I would be getting really, really close to the number of the die, and I don't want that. And now for the final step, nice and easy, all you're gonna do is go ahead and trim off any of that excess silicone around the cap. I just do it with a little pair of scissors so that you have a nice, clean, circular cap without all of that floppy extra stuff that you don't need. And after this, you've done it! You've made vented squish molds. Congratulations! So now as I remove my masters from my molds, it is time to discuss the advantages and the disadvantages of this style of mold compared to a popular mold style like a cap mold. I would argue that the advantages here are threefold. One, you have a lot less finishing work with this style of mold than a cap mold. Two, you are much less likely to experience voids and surface bubbles due to the reservoir. And three, you are also less likely to experience lifted faces due to the way that the cap positions itself in the mold. And I would also argue that the disadvantages are threefold. One, these are more difficult and take more time to make. Two, I do believe they use more silicone than a cap mold. And three, you do kind of need to have deep numbers on your dice masters, or you may experience either more severe mold marks or be sanding the numbers of your dice off in an effort to eliminate all of the mold marks with this mold style. Oh, and four, but this is pretty minor, you have a little bit less surface area to work with. So I do make cap molds for my blanks because they are fast and easy, and you can see you get the entire dice face to work with, as opposed to the vented squish where because you're coming at less than the edge of the dice, you have less of the surface to work with, but I have found that that's a pretty minor difference. But it is something to keep in mind if you do some sort of style of dice that requires you to have that entire face to work with, you only get a little bit less with a vented squish mold. So let me show you what I mean about the advantages. This is a blank that I cast in my cap mold, and as with cap molds, you end up with the flashing that goes over all of the adjacent sides of the die. So I can just trim that off with this because it's a blank, so it's going to be decorated and cast again, and it's very forgiving. But if this was an actual die, I would trim that off, and then I would need to sand all of these other adjacent faces to ensure that there are as minimal marks as possible. So for something like this D6, for example, I would need to, if this was a die, sand all 4 adjacent sides and probably also the cap side, meaning I'm sanding 5 sides of the die, which is a lot of sanding work. I mean, even doing one side, my shoulder kills me every day. Doing more sides is not fun. Whereas with the vented squish, you can see that the line of my flashing, again, does not go all the way to the die edge. So there is no need for me to sand any of these adjacent sides to my cap face. I only need to sand the cap face, which is so convenient. Next, voids. Because with a cap mold, when the bubbles are eliminated, there is no extra resin to fill the space that is left by that decreased volume. You tend to have voids, which if you had a die number here, can be a big pain to fill because it interferes with the number. Whereas with a vented squish, You can see this little triangle here is the sprue, where the reservoir of resin comes down that sprue and is able to fill in that excess space, meaning a much smaller chance of voids. And third, lifted faces. It's really hard to see here, but there is a little bit of lift in this face. The resin goes higher than it should, and if you try to sand this down with a die, you run a risk of sanding your number off if the lifted face is severe enough. With a vented squish mold, because your caps have the indicator, they position themselves in really securely, and I almost never have issues with having a lifted face. However, the major disadvantage, I would argue, is the risk of more severe mold marks, especially if your numbers are not deep enough. You can see here where I'm pointing, that's a pretty deep mold mark on this die. And if you want to sand that off, you need to have numbers that are deep enough that they will not disappear in your efforts to eliminate those more severe mold marks. For me, because I know this is my mold style, I was able to order my masters with my numbers a little bit deeper and my one face numbers a little bit deeper than all of my other numbers, so that I have a lot of wiggle room to get rid of these mold marks while preserving my numbers, but obviously that's not something everyone can do. So here I'm showing what my typical mold marks look like in finished dice. You can see a tiny little mark on that one face and then no marks on any of the adjacent faces because, again, that is the benefit of this mold style. Same with the D6, a couple more little tiny marks here, but no marks on any of the 4 adjacent faces. So if you do have shallow numbers, you do run the risk of having slightly more severe mold marks. Initially, when I first started making this style of mold, my numbers were a little bit more shallow, but I was still happy with the fact that at least those marks were only on one face of the die. And finally, I just wanted to show you what a slightly more severe mold mark looks like. I can go back in and fix this up, again, because my numbers are deep enough, but this might be more akin to what you would get if you have more shallow numbers. So they're not too bad, but they are definitely a little bit more noticeable. And with that, I believe that is all. Holy cow, this has been a long video. And somehow I feel like I was still rushing to say everything that I wanted to say. So with that, that is all I have for you today. Maybe drop a like if you liked the video. Consider subscribing if you want to see more. And as always, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. Let me know if you try out this mold style and what you think. And I will see you all in the next one. Bye-bye!